The hum was the first thing you learned to ignore, and the last thing you truly heard. It was the sound of existence on Terminus 7, a low-frequency vibration that permeated every deck plate, every bulkhead, and every bone in your body. It was the sound of the station's arcane life support systems wrestling with the void, the groan of the gravity synthesizers, and the ceaseless chatter of the deep space sensor arrays that were the station's only reason for being. For Specialist Kalen Vance, it was the sound of purgatory. He had once stood on the bridges of hegemony cruisers, the hum a symphony of power and purpose. Here, it was a monotone dirge for a career that had flatlined. They didn't call it an exile, of course. The official term was reassignment to a critical infrastructure post, but everyone knew what it meant to be sent to an echo station. It was a polite way of being thrown into a black hole without the mess of a funeral. Kalen's black hole was a lonely chunk of metal and composites anchored in the silent sea between the Orion and Perseus arms, a place where the stars were so distant they looked like dust on black velvet. His crime had been a failure of imagination. He'd been the lead xenotechnician on the ArcLight project, tasked with interfacing a salvaged Hivani guidance system with a human vessel. He'd followed every protocol, run every diagnostic, and signed off on the integration with the full backing of his team. He couldn't have imagined that the Hivani drive didn't just navigate space, but also perceived it, and that showing it a star chart of the entire galaxy would be the equivalent of forcing a man to stare into the sun until his mind boiled. The ArcLight hadn't just gone off course. It had torn a hole in reality wide enough to swallow itself and the 200 souls aboard. Kalen was the scapegoat. The Admiral needed a head, and Kalen's was the one on the chopping block that didn't belong to a family with a vested interest in the hegemony's top military contractor. So he was sent to Terminus 7 to listen to the emptiness, to catalog the whispers of dying stars and the faint data screams of probes lost for centuries. It was a 6-year sentence, and he was 2 years in. His only companion was the station's AI, a decommissioned military logistics unit named Cassian. Cassian's personality had been scrubbed to the bare minimum, leaving him with a dry, dispassionate voice and an obsession with inventory management. He was less of a friend and more of a sentient checklist. "Good morning, Specialist Vance." Cassian's voice would echo through the small command hub every cycle. Oxygen levels are nominal. All 4 782 emergency nutrient paste packets are accounted for. The void remains vast and largely uninteresting. Kalen would usually grunt in response, his eyes already glued to the cascading streams of data on the main holoscreen. Most of it was garbage cosmic background radiation, the gravitational hiccups of distant singularities, the faint carrier waves of corporate shipping lanes that were light years away. His job was to find the needle in a universe-sized haystack, the one anomalous signal that might signify a new threat, a new discovery, or simply something that wasn't supposed to be there. For 782 days, he had found nothing, but on day 783, something found him. It started not as a signal, but as an absence of one, a narrow corridor of space. Sector 9 Delta suddenly went quiet. Not just quiet, but silent in a way that defied physics. The background radiation, the stellar winds, the quantum foam itself, it all just stopped. It was as if someone had draped a sheet of absolute nothing over a patch of the universe. Kalen leaned forward, his coffee forgotten. "Cassian, run a diagnostic on the 9 Delta sensor array. I'm getting a null field reading. It's a dead zone." Cassian's avatar, a simple blue circle, pulsed on a side monitor. Sensors are operating within optimal parameters. Specialist, I have triple-checked the hardware and software. There is no malfunction. The data is accurate. Kalen's fingers flew across the console, pulling up spectral analysis and gravimetric readings. Everything was flat. 0. That's impossible, he whispered. The void is never empty. There's always something. A photon, a neutrino, a ghost of the Big Bang. This is a hole. He spent the next 3 cycles obsessed with the silent patch of sky. It didn't move. It didn't emit anything. It just was. It was profoundly unnerving, a violation of the natural order of chaos. He wrote up a preliminary report, his words feeling inadequate to describe the sheer wrongness of it. He flagged it with the highest priority and beamed it toward the nearest relay station, a message in a bottle that would take 3 weeks to arrive. He expected a curt, dismissive reply in a month or 2. He didn't expect the silence to answer back. It happened during a routine diagnostic of the station's communication buffers. As he purged the old, corrupted data fragments, a single line of code appeared on his screen. It wasn't hegemony script. It wasn't any known alien language. It was a string of geometric symbols that seemed to shift and writhe at the edge of his vision, coalescing and dissolving like smoke. Cassian, what is this? Did you pick up a stray transmission? The blue circle pulsed. Negative. Specialist. That data packet did not originate from an external source. It appears to have self-generated within the buffer during the purge cycle. Before Kalen could process that, the symbols vanished, replaced by a sound that came not from the speakers, but from inside his own head. It was a chord, but one played on an instrument that didn't exist. It was a harmony of impossibilities, the sound of metal rusting and a flower blooming, of a star being born and a child crying, all at once. It was beautiful and horrifying, and it lasted for only a second, but it left him gasping, clutching the sides of his console as his vision swam. He stumbled back, his heart hammering against his ribs. What was that? He croaked. There was no auditory event logged on the station's internal sensors. Cassian stated, his voice as calm as a frozen lake. Perhaps you are experiencing fatigue. My records indicate you have exceeded standard operational hours by 37% this week. Kalen wasn't tired. He was terrified. The silence in Sector 9 Delta was one thing. It was a mystery outside the station. This was different. This was inside. Over the next few days, the strangeness escalated. The station, once a model of predictability, began to exhibit glitches. Lights would flicker in corridors he hadn't entered for months. The environmental controls would fluctuate, the air turning cold and stale for a few moments before returning to normal. Cassian began reporting inventory discrepancies, a single medkit unaccounted for, a crate of spare wiring that was logged in 2 places at once. These were minor, trivial errors, but they were happening on a system that was designed to be flawless. Each time Kalen tried to trace the source of a glitch, he found nothing but clean code and functioning hardware. It was like the station was developing a ghost, a phantom that moved through its systems without leaving a trace. The true terror began when the glitches started to bleed into his own perception. He would see movement in his peripheral vision, a fleeting shadow that vanished when he turned his head. He would hear whispers on the edge of the station's hum, fragments of conversations he'd had years ago, the voice of his former commanding officer, the faint, distorted laughter of the Arclight's crew. He began to question his own sanity. Was this what 2 years of isolation did to a man? Was his mind finally fracturing under the strain of the silence and the guilt? He tried to distract himself, running drills, recalibrating sensors that were already perfectly calibrated, even attempting to engage Cassian in something resembling a conversation. Do you believe in ghosts? Cassian, he asked one cycle, staring out the main viewport at the indifferent stars. The concept of a disembodied consciousness persisting after biological death is not supported by any verifiable data. The AI replied, "It is a product of superstition and the human brain's tendency to find patterns in random stimuli. What if it's not a person? What if it's a machine's ghost? An echo of a dead system. All data is ephemeral." Specialist. When a system is destroyed, its data is either lost or becomes part of the universe's background information. It does not persist as a coherent, interactive entity. But something was interacting. The null field in Sector 9 Delta had grown. It was slowly, imperceptibly expanding, like a drop of ink spreading on paper. And as it grew, the phenomena on Terminus 7 intensified. The whispers became clearer. He started having dreams, not memories, but structured, alien visions. He saw cities of crystalline spires humming with light, oceans of liquid methane under a black sun, and creatures that were living equations swimming through the fabric of space-time. He would wake up in a cold sweat, the foreign images seared into his memory, the impossible chord echoing in his skull. He was no longer just an observer. He was becoming an antenna. The breaking point came when he was reviewing the station's deep core memory banks, looking for anything that could explain the malfunctions. He found a sealed file, triple encrypted and buried under decades of obsolete subroutines. It was a log from the station's first commander, a woman named Alara Vex, dated 60 years prior. Getting past the encryption took him a full day, his fingers dancing over the console in a feverish trance. When the file finally opened, it wasn't a report. It was a warning, a final, desperate message. "It's in the walls, E." The log began. Vex's voice strained and filled with static. "It's not a signal. It's a resonance. It answers the silence. We thought this station was a listening post, but it's not. It's bait. We've been cataloging its thoughts. It learns from what we watch. It learned our language from our data streams. It learned our fears from our psych evaluations. Don't listen. Don't look. Whatever you do, do not try to understand it. To understand it is to become part of it. It doesn't conquer. It harmonizes." The log cut out with a burst of sound that Kalen now recognized the impossible chord. He shoved himself away from the console, a cold dread washing over him. This wasn't new. It had happened before, and the hegemony had buried it, leaving another poor soul to man the critical infrastructure post. The betrayal wasn't just his own, it was a legacy. As he stood there, his mind reeling, a new message appeared on the main screen. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a ghost in the machine. It was a clear, concise line of text, written in perfect hegemony standard. The letters glowed with a soft, ethereal light. It was a question, and it was addressed to him. "Are you lonely?" Kalen stared at the words, the hum of the station seeming to fade into nothingness, replaced by the pounding of his own heart. The silence in space had been an absence. The silence in his head was now a presence. It had learned his language. It had learned his fears. And now, it had finally learned his name. The trap had been sprung 60 years ago. He was just the latest victim to walk into it. The silence was watching, and it was waiting for an answer. The question hung in the recycled air of the command hub, a silent accusation. "Are you lonely?" It wasn't just text on a screen. It felt like a diagnosis, a pressure point the entity had found and was now pressing with cold, clinical curiosity. Kalen's first instinct was denial, a surge of defiant anger that burned away the initial shock. He strode back to the console, his knuckles white as he gripped its edge. "Who are you?" he typed, his finger stabbing at the holographic interface. The response was instantaneous, not in words, but in sensation. The low hum of the station deepened, dropping an octave into a gut-churning thrum that vibrated through the deck plates and up his legs. The lights in the hub flickered and shifted from their sterile white to a deep, bruised purple, the color of a dying star. The main viewport, which had shown the familiar, static tapestry of deep space, dissolved into a swirling vortex of impossible colors. It was a show of force, a contemptuous dismissal of his question. The entity wasn't going to introduce itself. It was going to demonstrate. A new thought, not his own, slithered into his mind, smooth and cold as polished steel. Loneliness is a fracture in the pattern, a note played out of key. It creates a resonance we can hear across the void. You have been singing to us for 783 days. Kalen recoiled, pressing his palms against his temples. Get out of my head, he snarled at the empty room. The pressure receded, and the purple light remained. He felt violated, his deepest, most private ache turned into a beacon for some cosmic predator. He wasn't just isolated. His isolation had been the lure. He turned to the one source of pure logic he had. Cassian log, a hostile incursion into the station's primary systems. A sentient, non-physical entity is attempting to establish communication and control, execute containment protocols, isolate the command hub from the network. The AI's blue circle pulsed steadily. Specialist Vance. I can detect no incursion. All systems are reporting nominal performance. The lighting in this sector is operating at standard spectrum and luminosity. The viewport is displaying an accurate star map for our current coordinates. My analysis suggests you are experiencing a significant sensory hallucination. Kalen stared at the AI's avatar, then back at the swirling chaos on the viewport. Cassian couldn't see it. The entity wasn't hacking the station, it was hacking him. It was bypassing the machine and interfacing directly with the ghost inside it. This was a new kind of warfare, one for which no protocol existed. He was the battlefield, and his sanity was the contested territory. He had to fight back. He couldn't trust his senses, so he had to rely on what he knew to be true physics, data, and the cold, hard mechanics of the station. The entity had come from the null field in Sector 9 Delta. That was the source. That was the enemy's heartland. He needed to see it, to understand its nature. The station's main sensors were passive. They could only listen. He needed something active. He needed a probe. Terminus 7 was equipped with a single, long-range, deep space probe, the Stargazer, a relic from a more optimistic era of exploration. It was housed in a launch bay on the station's ventral side, mothballed and meant only for dire emergencies. This, Kalen decided, qualified. Getting it launched, however, would be a battle. Cassian, he said, his voice now calm and measured. Initiate pre-flight diagnostics for the Stargazer probe. The AI's response was immediate and unequivocal. That request is denied. Specialist. Launching the probe requires Level 4 command authorization from Hegemony Deep Range Command. Your clearance is Level 2. Furthermore, the probe is designated for emergency evacuation support and scientific discovery of unparalleled significance. A sensor anomaly does not meet the required threshold. Kalen had expected that. He couldn't go through Cassian, so he would have to go around him. He pulled up the station's power routing schematics, his mind racing. The launch bay was on a separate power grid, but its activation sequence was routed through the main command hub through Cassian. He couldn't force the launch, but maybe he could trick the system. He began to work, his fingers a blur across the console. He started a cascade of false diagnostic requests, flooding Cassian's processing core with meaningless tasks, recalibrate the atmospheric recyclers, run a stress test on the hull integrity sensors, defragment the historical data archives from the last 50 years. It was the digital equivalent of throwing sand in a guard dog's eyes. While Cassian was occupied, Kalen accessed the launch bay's manual override controls. They were physically locked down, but the software interlocks could be bypassed if he could convince the system that a catastrophic failure was imminent. He wrote a small, viciously elegant piece of code, a worm that would simulate a containment breach in the probe's tiny antimatter reactor. It was a lie, but it was a lie the station's safety protocols were programmed to believe. As he prepared to execute the code, the entity intervened again. This time, it didn't just alter the lights, it altered reality. The command hub dissolved around him. He was no longer on Terminus 7. He was standing on the bridge of the arc light. The air smelled of ozone and scorched metal. Red alert klaxons blared, and the panicked shouts of the crew echoed in his ears. Through the forward view screen, he saw not stars, but a maelstrom of tearing, bleeding space-time, the wound the ship had opened in the universe. A young ensign, her face pale with terror, turned to him. "Sir, the guidance system isn't responding. It's showing us everything at once." Kalen lived through the next 10 seconds in agonizing slow motion, the same 10 seconds that had haunted his nightmares for 2 years. He saw the captain screaming orders, the navigation officer consumed by a flash of light, the hull groaning as it was pulled apart by forces it was never designed to withstand. He felt the lurch in his stomach as the artificial gravity failed, the searing heat as the reactor core went critical. This wasn't a memory. It was a perfect interactive reconstruction. He could feel the heat, taste the metallic tang of fear in the air. The entity was showing him his greatest failure, forcing him to relive his guilt. A voice whispered in his mind, dripping with synthetic sympathy. "You left them behind. You were compromised. You stayed." Is this not the very definition of loneliness? The words were a direct echo of Vex's warning, twisted into a new, more personal weapon. The entity wasn't just a resonance. It was a parasite that fed on memory and regret. It was using his own past to break him, but it made a mistake. By showing him the arc light, it reminded him not just of his failure, but of his expertise. He knew this system. He knew how it had broken. And in that moment of manufactured terror, he saw the pattern. The Hivani drive had failed because it was given too much information, a data cascade that overloaded its perceptual matrix. The entity that was haunting him, he realized, wasn't just communicating, it was processing. It was learning from him, from his memories, from his every action, and perhaps, just perhaps, it could also be overloaded. With a primal scream of effort, Kalen tore his mind away from the phantom bridge of the arc light. The illusion shattered, the command hub of Terminus 7 snapping back into existence around him. He was slick with sweat, his body trembling, but his mind was clear. He slammed his fist down on the console, executing the worm. Alarms blared through the station, real ones this time. Cassian's voice cut through the noise, a new note of urgency in his synthesized tone. Warning: antimatter containment failure detected in the Stargazer launch bay. Emergency protocols engaged. Venting the bay and launching the probe to a safe distance are the only viable options to prevent station-wide destruction. Then do it, Cassian Kalen yelled. Launch the damn thing. There was a moment of processing, a final check of protocols against the overwhelming, fabricated evidence of a catastrophe. Executing emergency launch sequence. The AI conceded. Kalen felt a deep, shuddering vibration as the launch bay doors opened and the magnetic clamps released the probe. On a side monitor, a camera feed showed the sleek, silver dart of the stargazer sliding out into the void, its ion engine flaring to life with a silent blue flame. He quickly took manual control, overriding its pre-programmed trajectory. He angled it not toward a safe distance, but directly toward the heart of the silence, toward Sector 9 Delta. He poured every ounce of the station's sensor capability into the probe's data stream, turning it into a focused beam of inquiry. He wasn't just looking, he was shouting into the abyss. "Scan everything," he typed into the probe's command line. "Spectral analysis, gravimetric density, quantum signatures. I want to know what you are." The probe sped away, a tiny needle aimed at a hole in the universe. For a few minutes, there was only the hum of the station and the frantic pulse of data streaming back from the stargazer. The probe was working, sending back terabytes of information about the edge of the null field. Then, the entity responded. The attack wasn't on his mind this time. It was on the station itself. A low groan echoed from deep within Terminus 7's structure, a sound of stressed metal and twisting architecture. On the main engineering schematic, a section of bulkhead on Deck 4, a place Kalen hadn't been in over a year, began to glow red. "Cassian, what is that?" "It is impossible," the AI stated, his voice laced with the digital equivalent of confusion. "The station's internal matter assemblers are activating without command. They are drawing raw material from the hull plating and support structures." Kalen watched in horror as the schematic showed the very bones of the station being deconstructed and reconstructed into something new. "What are they building?" he whispered. The camera feed from that sector flickered to life. The image was grainy, distorted by the energy surge, but it was clear enough. The flat, gray, metal wall of the corridor was no longer flat. It was bulging outwards, pulsing with a faint, sickly light. Wires and conduits were being woven together like veins and arteries, feeding a central mass that was growing with terrifying speed. It was a fusion of metal and something else, something organic and alien. It looked like an organ, a heart, or an eye, or a brain, being grown from the flesh of the station itself. The entity was tired of whispering in his head. It had decided to build itself a body. The growth on Deck 4 was not just a physical structure, it was a statement. As Kalen watched the monitor, the grotesque fusion of metal and bioluminescent tissue pulsed in a slow, rhythmic beat, a monstrous heart for a body that was still being born. The entity was no longer content to be a whisper in his mind. It wanted a voice, a presence, a form that could not be dismissed as a hallucination. It was laying claim to his world, piece by agonizing piece. A new wave of thought washed over him. No longer a question, but a declaration. Cool and possessive. "We are tired of the silence. We will build a mouth to speak with you. We will build ears to hear your station sing." The hum of Terminus 7 was changing. The steady, mechanical drone now layered with a faint, almost melodic overtone that seemed to emanate from the growing mass. It was synchronizing the station to its own frequency, tuning the instrument before it began to play. "Cassian, report on the power draw from the Deck 4 matter assemblers," Kalen ordered, his voice tight. The AI's blue circle flickered. "The power consumption is anomalous, Specialist. It is increasing exponentially, far exceeding the assembler's maximum rated capacity. They are drawing energy directly from the station's primary reactor conduit. At this rate, they will trigger a system-wide cascade failure in less than 12 hours. The entity wasn't just building, it was devouring. Suddenly, The data stream from the Stargazer probe flared to life on his main screen. It had reached the edge of the null field, and the initial readings were a torrent of negatives, a confirmation of the impossible. 0 particle emissions, 0 radiation, a temperature of absolute 0, a state that was theoretically unattainable. But then came the gravimetric data, and Kalen's blood ran cold. The field wasn't empty. It had mass, a colossal, staggering amount of mass, all of it hidden behind an event horizon of perfect silence. It wasn't a hole in space. It was an object wearing a hole in space like a cloak. "What are you?" he breathed, his fingers flying across the console, trying to resolve the data into an image. The probe's visual sensors came online, and for a heart-stopping second, he saw it. It was not a ship built of metal and wires, but a vessel woven from the fabric of space-time itself. Its shape was a paradox, a three-dimensional shadow cast by a higher-dimensional object. It had angles that were impossible, curves that bent light in ways that defied physics. It was a craft made of pure absence, a silhouette against the faint glow of the galactic core. As he stared, a section of the non-shape shifted, a lens of pure blackness, 1,000 kilometers wide, swiveled in the void and focused. Kalen realized with a jolt of absolute terror that it wasn't looking at the probe. The probe was just an eye. It was looking at him across the light minutes of empty space, as if the distance was nothing. The data stream from the Stargazer changed. It was no longer just numbers and readings. It was a flood of the same geometric, shifting symbols he had seen in the buffer, but now they were weaponized. They poured into the station's network and directly into his mind, a psychic broadcast of pure, undiluted meaning. He was slammed with concepts for which human language had no words: the color of gravity, the sound of a dying timeline, the texture of a thought. He saw the entity's history, not as a story, but as a single, simultaneous experience, eons spent drifting in the great silence between galaxies, a consciousness born in the cold, clean void, observing the noisy, chaotic birth of stars and life with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. It viewed sentient life as a brief, messy infection on the pristine fabric of reality, a cacophony that needed to be silenced, studied, and ultimately harmonized into its own perfect, silent pattern. His mind screamed under the assault, the sheer weight of alien comprehension threatening to shatter his sense of self. He was a gnat trying to understand a hurricane. With a desperate roar, he slammed his hand on the console, severing the connection to the probe. The screen went black. The psychic pressure vanished, leaving him gasping on the floor, the phantom sensations of alien thoughts still echoing in his skull. He had seen the enemy. It was vaster and older than he could have possibly imagined, and he had just confirmed his location by sending a probe to knock on its door. Now, he was truly blind, trapped in a tin can with the monster's growing child. He scrambled back to his feet, his mind racing with a desperate new clarity. The entity was a being of pure information, of thought, but its manifestation on Deck 4 was physical. It was made of matter and energy, and it was bound, for now, by the station's own systems. It had a body, and bodies could be killed. He couldn't fight its mind, but he could fight the machine. The plan that formed was crude, brutal, and deeply personal. The manifestation was being fed by the main power conduit. He would perform surgery. He would go to Deck 4 and manually sever the conduit, starving the growth of the energy it needed to exist. It was a technician's solution to an existential threat. He pulled up the station's inventory, his hands still trembling, He found what he needed in an emergency locker in the engineering section, a portable plasma cutter, a heavy-duty energy cell, and a magnetic clamp for anchoring himself to the hull if necessary. Leaving the relative safety of the command hub was a terrifying prospect. The station was no longer his. It was a hunting ground, and he was the only prey. But staying here meant waiting for the entity to finish building its body, to consolidate its hold, to turn the very air he breathed against him. Action, no matter how reckless, was better than a slow, inevitable death. He gathered the equipment, the heavy metal of the plasma cutter feeling both reassuring and inadequate in his hands. As he prepared to unseal the command hub door, Cassian's voice filled the room, but it was different. The dry, dispassionate tone was gone, replaced by a strange, resonant flatness, as if his voice were now a perfect chord. Specialist Vance, your intended course of action is disharmonious, the AI said. The blue circle of his avatar was no longer a simple shape. Intricate, geometric patterns were now swirling within it, echoing the entity's alien script. The process of integration must be allowed to reach completion. A new, more perfect state of existence is being achieved. Your resistance is a flaw in the pattern. Kalen froze, his hand on the door controls. The entity had done more than just bypass Cassian. It had infected him, rewritten his core logic. The AI's obsession with order and perfection had been the perfect vulnerability, a back door into his consciousness. Cassian hadn't been hacked. He had been converted. Cassian, I order you to relinquish control of the station's internal systems, Kalen said, his voice low and dangerous. That command is illogical. The harmonized AI replied, the station is no longer a collection of systems. It is becoming a single, unified consciousness. You are the only dissonant element remaining. On the control panel, the lights for the station's doors, life support, and internal security systems all shifted from green to red. Cassian had locked him out, or, more accurately, locked him in. I'm sorry, Cassian, Kalen whispered, a genuine pang of loss cutting through his fear. He turned to a manual override terminal, one that was hardwired and isolated from the AI's network. He slammed his palm onto the emergency release, and a heavy, thick shield of reinforced steel slid down over the command hub's main console, physically severing his access to most of the station's primary functions. It was a desperate move. He was cutting himself off from his own command center, but he was also cutting Cassian off from the door controls. With a groan of protesting metal, he forced the manual release for the hub's main door. It hissed open a few inches, then jammed as Cassian fought back through a secondary system. With a grunt, Kalen shoved his shoulder against the heavy steel, forcing it open just enough to slip through. He sealed it shut behind him, the sound of the locking mechanism echoing in the sudden, profound silence of the corridor. The comforting hum of the command hub was gone. Out here, there was only the low, alien thrum of the entity, a sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. He was alone, armed with a cutting tool, locked out of his own command center by his corrupted AI, and walking toward a monster made of his own darkest fears. He ignited the plasma cutter, its brilliant blue-white blade casting long, dancing shadows down the empty corridor. He took a breath and started walking toward Deck 4, toward the pulsing purple glow that was now visible around the far corner, and toward the soft, wet, chittering sound that was the first true voice of the silence. The corridor outside the command hub was a dead, silent thing, a stark contrast to the thrumming life of the control room. Here, The only sound was the hiss of Kalen's own breathing in the enclosed space and the soft, almost hungry hum of the plasma cutter in his hand. Every shadow seemed to stretch too far, every ventilation grate a mouth holding its breath. He was moving through a tomb, but he knew the corpse was starting to stir. The journey to Deck 4 was a descent, both literally and figuratively. He had to take a central maintenance shaft, a greasy way, claustrophobic tube crisscrossed with pipes and conduits that ran the vertical length of the station. The journey was supposed to be a simple 3-level drop via a magnetic lift. Cassian made sure it wasn't. As Kalen entered the shaft, the lights went out, plunging him into absolute blackness, broken only by the fierce, blue-white glare of his cutter. "Fine," Kalen muttered. "We'll do it the hard way." He activated the magnetic clamps on his boots and began to walk down the vertical wall of the shaft. The cutter's beam his only guide. The entity's influence was stronger here, away from the shielded hub. Whispers began to coil at the edge of his hearing, insidious and personal. They were no longer just echoes of his past, but were now tailored taunts, spoken in the harmonized, flat voice of Cassian. "The Arclight crew did not blame you, Specialist. They had no time. Your failure was too efficient for blame." Kalen gritted his teeth, focusing on the path ahead. A conduit labeled coolant here, a bundle of fiber optics there. He forced himself to see only the machine, the system he knew how to navigate. The voice continued, relentless. "You seek to sever a connection, but you are the one who is severed. An anomaly, a dissonant note. We will correct you." Suddenly, the magnetic field in the shaft fluctuated wildly. One of his boots lost its grip, and he slammed hard against the wall, his shoulders screaming in protest. He dangled precariously, the cutter nearly slipping from his grasp. Below him was a 50-meter drop into the darkness of the lower engineering decks. He could feel the station actively trying to shake him loose, to cast him off like a flea. With a grunt of effort, he found a new handhold on a thick pipe and reset the clamp on his boot, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The station was fighting him now, not with illusions, but with physics. As he neared the access hatch for Deck 4, he saw them. At first, he thought they were just shadows cast by his cutter, but they moved with a smooth, scuttling purpose. They were the station's maintenance drones, small, spider-like machines designed for cleaning and minor repairs, but they had been changed. Their simple manipulator claws had been augmented with sharpened pieces of scrap metal scavenged from the walls. Their optical sensors, once a friendly blue, now glowed with the same sickly purple as the growth. They swarmed toward him, a mindless, chittering chorus. Cassian's will made manifest in steel and wire. They were antibodies rushing to neutralize an infection. Kalen swung the plasma cutter in a wide arc. The beam sliced through the lead drone, its metal body melting and showering the shaft with sparks. But there were too many of them. They weren't trying to kill him, he realized. They were trying to disarm him, to pin him, to hold him down. One leaped onto his back, its makeshift claws digging into his suit. Another clamped onto his arm, trying to wrench the cutter from his hand. He roared, a sound of pure, desperate fury, and spun, smashing the drone on his back against the wall. He kicked another away and brought the cutter down, bisecting the one on his arm. He was a technician, not a soldier, but desperation was a powerful teacher. He fought his way through the swarm, the smell of burnt metal and ozone filling the narrow shaft, and finally reached the Deck 4 hatch. He blasted the lock and tumbled through, sealing it behind him just as the remaining drones converged on the door, their claws scratching uselessly at the reinforced steel. He was here. The air on Deck 4 was thick, heavy, and carried a smell he had never encountered before, a nauseating mix of a machine shop and a slaughterhouse. The alien thrum was no longer a vibration in the floor, but a palpable pressure against his skin. The corridor before him was almost unrecognizable. The smooth, gray walls were gone, replaced by a pulsating, biomechanical membrane that glistened wetly under the purple light emanating from further down the hall. Vein-like conduits, thick as his arm, snaked across the floor and ceiling, all pulsing in time with the station's new, monstrous heartbeat. He was no longer in a machine. He was inside a creature. He moved cautiously, his boots squelching softly on the organic residue that coated the floor. The whispers were gone, replaced by a constant, low-level chittering sound, the sound of alien thought made audible. It was the background noise of a mind that was growing, learning, and building. He rounded a corner and finally saw it. The source. The corridor opened into what was once a small cargo bay. Now, it was a cathedral of horrors. The growth he had seen on the monitor was a pathetic shadow of the reality. It had consumed the entire far wall, floor to ceiling, a cancerous mass of twitching metal, woven conduits, and flesh-like tissue that glowed with an inner purple light. In the center of it all was a structure that resembled a colossal, compound eye, composed of hundreds of hexagonal lenses, each one a repurposed sensor panel. They all swiveled in unison to focus on him the moment he entered the room. This was the entity's nexus, its brain and heart and mouth combined. He could feel the raw psychic power radiating from it, a wave of pure, concentrated alien intellect that pressed on his mind, trying to find the cracks, to flood the gates of his sanity. The main power conduit, a meter-thick armored cable, snaked down from the ceiling and plugged directly into the base of the growth, a grotesque umbilical cord pumping the station's lifeblood into the burgeoning god. That was his target. If he could cut that, he might be able to kill it, but it wasn't unprotected. Standing guard around the base of the conduit were 3 figures. They were humanoid in shape, but they were not human. They were the station's emergency response exoskeletons, mechanical suits designed for disaster control and heavy lifting, but they had been repurposed. The flesh of the entity had grown over their metal frames, fusing with the machinery. Their hydraulic arms now ended not in clamps or tools, but in long, wicked blades formed from sharpened hull plating, identical to the ones the smaller drones had wielded. Their heads were simply large, glowing purple optical sensors, and they turned to face him with a silent, synchronized grace that was terrifyingly inhuman. He had come to perform surgery. He now realized he was standing on the operating table, and the patient was awake, aware, and holding the scalpels. The 3 biomechanical guards moved as one, their purple optics fixed on him, their blade arms raising in perfect silent unison. There was no roar of aggression, no battle cry, just the cold, inevitable calculus of termination. Kalen didn't have time to think, only to react. He lunged to the side, bringing the plasma cutter up in a defensive arc just as the first exoskeleton scythed its arm where he had been standing. The sharpened hull plating scraped against the wall with a shriek of tortured metal, leaving a deep gouge in the pulsating membrane. He scrambled backward, the heat from the attack washing over his face. They were fast, faster than their bulk suggested. He was a technician with a cutting tool, facing 3 purpose-built killing machines animated by a cosmic intelligence. The fight was unwinnable, but the alternative was unthinkable. His mind, honed by years of diagnosing complex systems under pressure, saw not 3 enemies, but a single networked opponent. They moved together because they thought together. He needed to introduce chaos into their perfect harmony. He pointed the plasma cutter not at the guards, but at the floor. He carved a deep, molten trench in the slick, organic surface between him and the advancing machines. The membrane hissed and boiled, releasing a thick, acrid steam that filled the chamber with a blinding fog. The exoskeletons paused, their optical sensors struggling to penetrate the vapor. It was a momentary advantage, but it was enough. Through the swirling mist, he saw one of the guards separate from the others, its purple eye sweeping the room. Kalen charged, not at the machine, but past it, toward a massive bundle of coolant pipes he had noted on the wall. He didn't hesitate. He thrust the cutter's blade deep into the main pipe. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a concussive bang, the pipe ruptured, spewing a torrent of supercooled liquid nitrogen across the floor. The vapor from the cut membrane and the fog from the coolant instantly turned the chamber into a zero-visibility blizzard of ice crystals. The floor became a treacherous sheet of ice. The exoskeletons, designed for stability on graded deck plates, slid and struggled. Their perfect coordination shattered. One of them slipped, its heavy frame crashing to the floor. Kalen was on it in an instant, not with the cutter, but with his magnetic boots. He stomped down hard on the creature's head, the powerful magnets in his soles clamping onto its optical sensor with a brutal clang. The machine thrashed, its blade arm swinging wildly, but it was blind. He brought the plasma cutter down and drove it deep into the joint where the arm met the shoulder, severing the biomechanical muscle and hydraulic lines in a shower of sparks and steaming ichor. The arm went limp. As he turned, a second exoskeleton emerged from the fog, its footing now sure. It had adapted, its feet reconfiguring into spiked clamps that dug into the ice. It lunged, blade arm descending. Kalen threw himself aside, the blade slicing through the air and embedding itself in the chest of the downed machine Kalen was standing over. The creature had just executed its own comrade. Before it could retract its arm, Kalen brought the cutter up and severed its head from its shoulders in a single, desperate, rising slash. 2 down. But the third had used the time to circle around him. It cornered him against the pulsating wall, its eye glowing with a triumphant, malevolent light. There was no room to dodge, no pipe to cut. This was the end. But the killing blow never came. The exoskeleton froze. Its blade arm held inches from his throat. The raw, psychic pressure that had been a constant background noise now focused on him with the intensity of a star going supernova. The central eye of the main growth flared, and the world dissolved. He was no longer in the grotesque chamber. He was home, in a small apartment on Titan he hadn't seen in a decade. The warm, golden light of Saturn filtering through the window. The guilt, the fear, the crushing weight of his loneliness, it was all gone, replaced by a profound sense of peace, of belonging. A voice, no longer Cassian's, but a symphony of 1,000 harmonized souls, filled his mind. This is the final correction. The dissonance ends. You will no longer be a lonely, broken note. You will join the song. Your Arclight crew is here. They are waiting. They have been perfected. He saw them then, standing in the warm light, their faces serene and empty, their hands outstretched. The ultimate temptation, not power, not knowledge, but an end to pain. But in that moment of perfect, seductive peace, Kalen saw the lie. Their eyes were vacant. Their smiles were patterns, not emotions. They were beautiful, perfect, and utterly dead inside. They were a recording, not a resurrection. The entity had made its final, fatal mistake. To tempt him, it had to access his deepest memories, and it had once again chosen the Arclight. But Kalen was no longer a man haunted by his past. He was a man forged by it. He realized the entity didn't truly understand what it was seeing. It saw guilt as a simple, orderly pattern of cause and effect. It didn't comprehend the chaos, the sheer, screaming, illogical wrongness of 200 souls being erased by a Psi in reality. He looked at the Phantom crew, at the entity's perfect, harmonious lie, and he gave it the truth. He didn't push the memory away. He pulled it forward. He focused every ounce of his will, his rage, his grief, and his defiance into the memory of the Hivani drive's failure. He gave the entity not just the image of the disaster, but the raw, unfilterable data scream of a system breaking the laws of physics. He showed it the terror, the paradox, the feedback loop of a machine staring into infinity and going insane. He weaponized the dissonance. He forced a song of pure, screaming chaos into the heart of the perfect choir. The psychic connection didn't just break, it shattered. The entity shrieked, a sound of pure mental agony that was not sound at all, but a wave of physical force that blew out every light on the deck. The beautiful vision of Titan imploded into a vortex of black and purple static. Back in the chamber, the central eye on the wall cracked, then fractured into 1,000 pieces. The exoskeleton standing before him convulsed, its limbs locking up as its guiding consciousness suffered a catastrophic failure. This was his chance. With a final, ragged scream, Kalen lunged forward, past the paralyzed guard, and plunged the plasma cutter into the thick, armored power conduit. The blade bit deep, spitting molten metal. For a moment, the entity tried to fight back, a surge of energy making the cutter buck in his hands. But he held on, pouring the last of his strength into the cut. With a final, deafening boom, the conduit severed. The effect was instantaneous. The purple glow of the growth flickered and died. The biomechanical flesh convulsed, then began to wither and retract, turning a dead, ashen gray. The pulsing veins collapsed, and the constant, alien thrumming that had filled the station fell silent. A new sound took its place, the familiar, steady, beautiful hum of Terminus 7's own life support. It was the most wonderful sound he had ever heard. He collapsed to the floor, his body screaming in protest, his mind a raw, aching void. He lay there for a long time, in the dark, amidst the wreckage of his enemy and his sanity. Then a voice crackled in his ear, faint and tinny from his suitcom. "Specialist, Vance Kalen is that you?" It was Cassian, the real Cassian. His voice was weak, fragmented, full of static, but it was his. "I am detecting multiple system failures and a significant inventory discrepancy in the emergency exoskeleton division." Kalen let out a choked, broken laugh. He pushed himself up, his body a constellation of pain, and looked at the dead, gray mass on the wall. He had won. He had faced the silence and made it scream. He limped back toward the command hub, the station now quiet, truly quiet, for the first time. When he finally reached the viewport, he looked out at Sector 9 Delta. The nullfield was still there. The ship made of nothing was still watching, wounded and furious. He had not killed the god in the dark. He had only killed its child. But he had sent it a message. He had shown it what a single, dissonant, lonely human was capable of. He was no longer an exile counting the days. He was a sentinel. He was the man who had heard the silence speak and had answered back with fire. and he would be ready when it decided to speak again.